own the only private building in the capital area. So you've got all these office buildings, the senators, the congressmen, you have the Supreme Court, and then you have the United Methodist building, which shows just how strong the United Methodists are. Jim worked with the Peace and Justice organization of the United Methodists, which at the time was called Church and Society, and every organization that would have a demonstration there that was left of center would call Jim up to use his facilities, and he would be more than kind in allowing them, and that's, I guess that was a way of keeping right on top of all the specific issues that are out there, as well as all the infighting. Well, he got so good at dealing with all of this that the other denominations said, well, let's hire him for the National Council of Churches. And so, and because he's a good friend and very near, when he comes home for the holidays, he comes out to Rockford to share his wisdom with us. Please welcome Jim Winkler.
Thank you for coming out on this wonderful, I thought it was going to be a really cold day, but it turned out to be a very nice day, and it's really great to be back here in Rockford with each of you. Grace and peace to you in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so it's, Stanley always contacts me and says, are you going to be home? And sure, and can you come over? I think one year I couldn't make it because there was a tremendous snowstorm, and I couldn't make the drive from Naperville up to here. Today we have beautiful weather. I know that he and Rockford Urban Ministries have been involved in peace work for a long time, and I think that we really kind of came to know each other at the time of the effort to avoid the war with Iraq. And so I said several times when I've been here, I've spoken about peace issues. Let me say a word, though, about coming here in this new role. About a year and a half ago, I was coming to an end to my time as General Secretary of the United Methodist Board of Church and Society. I'd been there for a long time, had a wonderful experience as General Secretary there. As Stanley said, I was also the landlord of the United Methodist building, and it was never a dull day in these occasions. And I was very proud of our church's importance and role in Washington and really all around the world. The last two General Secretaries of the National Council of Churches have been good friends of mine, Bob Edgar and Michael Kinnaman. And I also was fully aware of how difficult things had been for a long time with the National Council of Churches. And so a little over a year ago, a friend of mine called and said, I'm on the search committee and I'd like you to apply to be General Secretary. And I said, oh, you must have raised the salary to $1 million. What? I said, that's what you'd have to pay me to do that job. Which they're not. And I said, really, best wishes, you need the right person for that role, and I hope you find him. And then the second person called on the search committee. I said, that's really flattering to have two people from the search committee call me, and I wish you well. And then an old friend, Archbishop Deacon Akazian, one of the Armenian Orthodox archbishops here in the United States, who I've known for a number of years. In fact, we've been on religious leadership delegations to the Middle East on several occasions. Called me up, and I said, Archbishop Deacon, I may be a Protestant, but please don't make me say no to an archbishop. You must do these. So I began thinking about it, praying about it, and put my name forward, and to my great surprise and pleasure, I stand before you now as the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. The Council really goes back more than 100 years. In fact, I thought of it this way. I grew up United Methodist, and I knew that my dad had always worked ecumenically, whatever community that we lived in. But you know, when you grow up through Sunday school and MYF and all that kind of thing, in a way, you can kind of live in a Methodist cocoon. There used to be a day when we said you were Methodist born and Methodist bred, and when you died, you were Methodist dead. But of course, you could put in there Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, whatever. But that's all changed. And one of the reasons, frankly, is this ecumenical movement that began some 100+ years ago. And so as I've worked ecumenically for a long time. I didn't just work in the United Methodist Board of Church and Society with other United Methodists. I mean, even in the United Methodist building, we hosted the offices of the United Church of Christ and the Presbyterians and Episcopalians. So on a daily basis, we all work together. My first job out of college was with the Pacific Conference of Churches in the Pacific Islands, which was an ecumenical institution. And so I began, though, thinking about the ecumenical movement differently as I moved into this role. And it occurred to me that it really began, the modern ecumenical movement, that is, because groups like the YMCA and the YWCA and the World Student Christian Federation all came about in the mid-1800s, and young people started asking the question, why do we have to have all these different denominations? Christ anticipated or really directed that there would be unity in the church. It's always been the stated goal of the church, and yet here we are, more disunified than ever. And so gradually things began happening. And in 1910 was a famous conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. And John R. Mott, a Methodist lay leader, and many other from other faiths began talking about winning the world for Christ. I know you've all heard that phrase. And so one of the things the churches did was, the Protestant churches, was they divided up the world. So when I was in Fiji, Fiji was Methodist. Next door, Vanuatu, which had been the New Hebrides, was Presbyterian, and so forth. So believe it or not, one element of Christian unity, so to speak, was dividing up the various worlds as the countries, as the European countries in America began to colonize the world. Now, I don't think that's what the young people had in mind, but it was a form of Christian unity that was taking place. And so in our seminaries of these various churches 100+ years ago, I think we began teaching our pastors it's more important that you're a faithful Christian than that you are part of a particular denomination. And I believe that our pastors over many, many years began teaching that to us lay people. And so by the time 25+ years ago that I was leading the new member class at Messiah United Methodist Church in Springfield, Virginia, and I would go around the table and ask people, what, if any, church did you grow up in? I found that people would say, oh, I grew up in military-based chapels. Our church was near the Pentagon. I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up Roman Catholic. In fact, I found our local church was virtually a refugee center for Roman Catholics and Southern Baptists. But there were also others. I grew up Presbyterian. I grew up United Methodist. I grew up in no church and so forth. Okay, why are you joining this church? That's easy. I love the pastor, the choir, the youth ministry, the divorce recovery program, the singles ministry, you name it. So people were attracted to our church because of its various ministries. And so I think this was common in a lot of churches, and they began saying, our denominational heritage and identity is not what's really drawing people in, or at least not very much. People are more interested in what we're doing in the community and in the vibrancy of our congregational life. And that's what we need to really concentrate on. Now, I still believe that people knew they were not joining a Mormon church or a Pentecostal church. They felt comfortable in this broad middle, if you would, of Episcopalians and Lutherans and Methodists and American Baptists and United Church of Christ and so on. These churches sought to actually unite. In the 1960s, there was what was called the Consultation on Church Union. And 9 churches that included also the African Methodists, the African Methodist Zion, the Christian Methodists, so not just white churches, also some black churches. They literally drew up a plan of union. And I think there was this expectation that some of these various denominations would literally merge together. But in the end, every church overwhelmingly rejected the restructure plan. Everyone valued their own identity and traditions, structure, and so forth. So there came this moment, well, what do we do then? We want to be together. We want to work together. We found that to be comfortable, but we know now we're not going to create one church. And so, yet I do think that the ecumenical movement for 40 years has been searching a little bit for the next step. Rather than say, we're just going to dissolve councils of churches, whether at the local level or the state level or the national or international level, we're just going to keep at it. We're not sure where it's going to lead, but we're going to keep at it. But one thing the church has said we know is that, what does it say there in Micah 6:8? We're commanded to love justice, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. We want to do that, and we can do that together, however that might manifest itself. So if you think about the National Council of Churches, where you had these various denominations come together, then emerges Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights struggle. So you have 7 black Methodist and Baptist denominations in the National Council of Churches asking their white church colleagues, what are you going to do? Here's this moment in history. This is the moment. And the churches stepped forward and became very active in the civil rights struggle. There's a couple of great books that were written and published just this year, because 2014 is the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And one of them is called, one of them is called like a bill that's come, the day, now I've forgotten the titles of both. I read both of them this year, and you can just Google if you want, 1964 Civil Rights Act books. And each of them talk about how the National Council of Churches played an important role in this. So, a different era, 1964. Members of Congress, typically like today, on weekends would fly back home to be speaking at the Rotary Club or in local churches or wherever it was. They'd go back home or just to see their families. So the churches had staff people in these various offices who were sympathetic with the civil rights struggle. So a staff person would pick up the phone, call the National Council of Churches office and say, the member of Congress, the senator, the congressperson, has just left for the airport and will be arriving in Rockford, Des Moines, wherever, at such and such. And so then in the local communities, they would have a welcoming committee of several clergy and lay people to meet the member of Congress at the airport to urge them to vote yes for the Civil Rights Act. Grassroots lobby, and they specifically focused on members of Congress from about Iowa through Ohio. They said this was the place. If you think about it, the Southern members were going to vote against the Civil Rights Act, and the Northeasterners were pretty much for it. This was sort of the central battleground, and churches played this incredibly vital role in passage of that civil rights struggle. Even so, it was incredibly controversial. We all know that. And what happened right after that? Vietnam. And there too, the churches began to work calling for an end to the Vietnam War. In some cases, really, just as it was beginning, even before it was controversial. So I think that you found the National Council of Churches in a lot of ways right on the front lines of social justice struggles, but viewed by many as just a social justice organization. But I came in and I found there's a couple of other aspects of it to it that are quite interesting. For example, the National Council of Churches has the copyright on the New Revised Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. So yesterday I walked into the Barnes & Noble in downtown Naperville and walked straight over to the Bible section where there were about 6 shelves of Bible, and I wanted to see how many of my Bibles are there. There were 2 of all these Bibles, lots of King James Version, New International Version, and so forth. And yet scholars and others tell me the New Revised Standard Version is the most respected version of the Bible in terms of scholarly value. So I'm actually working with a firm that specializes in marketing and branding of Bible products, because I want the NRSD and the RSV to be more highly visible in our denominations and in our bookstores and all that kind of stuff. So that's an aspect, caring for the scriptures. I thought, I really have responsibility for caring for this amazing spiritual resource, center of our lives, but also intellectual property resource, if you will. The National Council of Churches produces Sunday school curriculum that is used by millions of young people and adults all over the country every year, or every week. And that goes back to the 1870s, when churches began to come together and say, while we're not interested in merging our churches, we should have our people studying the same scripture, because they're going to be talking together as neighbors, they're going to be talking together in workplaces, and so what's called the uniform study lessons continue to this day. So it's really a very fascinating type of experience that I've had even in this short time at the National Council of Churches. It goes beyond social issues, but social issues are often kind of the ones that grab a lot of the headlines, if you will. So Stanley asked me to kind of talk about the world peace, and I'm standing out here before you just a few days after the announcement by Presidents Obama and Castro of move toward normalization of relations with the U.S. and Cuba. I went to Cuba in 2001 to the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Council of Churches. It was a great experience. There were people from all over the world who had come to participate in this. And as you know, most of the world, of course, is in regular and normal contact with Cuba. We're really the principal country that has not been in touch with Cuba. But here we are, most of us here in this room, I think, are United Methodists. Well, we had Methodist churches in Cuba before the revolution of 1959 and after the revolution of 1959. Now, before 1959, they were part of the Florida Conference of the Old Methodist Church. After that, of course, they became their own denomination. And probably starting about 20 years ago, the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church began reestablishing relationships with churches in Cuba. So there were church groups moving back and forth all the time. My dad and my brother, who's pastor in Barrington, have both led numerous groups to Cuba of church members from here over the years. And this is not unusual. Methodists, Catholics, Presbyterians, Lutherans have been going back and forth or remaining in contact for a long, long time. Shortly after I took over, Joel de Pico, a Presbyterian minister in Veradero, Cuba, who's also the president of the Cuban Council of Churches, got in touch with me and he said, Jim, we're going to have to work together here to try to bring about an improvement of relations between our two countries. And I want to be honest, I said to him, I'd love to, Joel. Not only is the National Council of Churches committed to it, but for many, many years, most of our member churches have called for an end to this embargo and normalization of relations. I said, but I don't know. I just don't know how to move the needle. It's been stuck on, poor relations for so long. I said, so I want you to know I'm with you. And I had about a million other things to do. And then the Cuban ambassador in Washington asked to have lunch with me. So we actually had breakfast with me. And my board chair, who's the General Secretary of the American Baptist Churches, was in town. So we had breakfast with the Cuban ambassador a few months ago and talked about relations between our two countries. A couple of months later, or a couple of months after that, I guess in about August of this year, I went up to New York and spent an afternoon with the Cuban foreign minister, or their Secretary of State. We sat and talked in the Cuban mission to the United Nations, which is just down the street from the UN. And he was telling me, he said, I was the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations at the time of 9/11. He said, I lived in this house. The Cuban mission also upstairs had the residence of the ambassador. He said, my kids went to school here. He said, so that was a very scary day. We just talked about that day, and I talked about how I was right there on Capitol Hill and evacuated the United Methodist building in a very scary time and so forth. And he said, but I want to thank you. He said, because it was in 1999 when the National Council of Churches took another risk and supported the reconciliation of Elian Gonzalez with his father. You remember that story? Now, why did the National Council of Churches get involved? Now, a lot of people just assume, oh, it's just because the National Council of Churches are practically communists themselves. No. It was because Cuban churches had said to the National Council here, can you help? And rather than say no, I mean, these are people we're regularly in touch with. Sure, let's do what we can. And of course, it turned out to be this enormous media free-for-all and all that kind of stuff. But Elian Gonzalez was reunited with his parents. I was with the United Methodist Board of Church Society at the time, and I remember, you may recall that the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches flew to Cuba to get the grandmothers and bring the grandmothers here. And then later on, the grandmothers and Elian went back to Cuba. And so there was this moment where Elian was in Washington, and they had a reception for the grandmothers at the United Methodist Building. And so here's this little 6-year-old boy, doesn't speak any English and so forth, and I thought, he's going to be in this room full of grown-ups. And so I brought my kids, who at the time were about 9 and 6, to play with him, just so that he'd have somebody to play with for a little while. So can you say that the churches persuaded Barack Obama and Raul Castro to make this decision a few weeks ago? No, you can't say that. Can you say that we were part of, I would call the architecture of what's taken place for a long time? I think you can. And I'll use another example. In 1956, the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches went to the Soviet Union, along with a delegation of National Council of Churches leaders, to meet with Russian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Baptist, and Lutheran leaders in Russia, because we had all those churches over there. And remember, there's Russian Orthodox churches here, of course, Armenian Orthodox churches here. And they're part of the National Council of Churches. So there's this normal interplay, even though Stalin, of course, brutally suppressed churches there. That didn't mean they stopped existing. And I remember back in high school, in social studies class, being led to believe that the churches in Russia were essentially just shams, that they were really just, they didn't really exist anymore, and that they were all run by the KGB and so forth. That's not true. Were they infiltrated? You bet they were. I suspect some of our churches are. But they were not controlled totally by the Communist Party or the KGB. They were and are authentic Christians. In fact, in 1992, you may recall, the United Methodist Church began what we called the Russia Initiative. And that wasn't because there weren't any Christians in Russia. It was we wanted to reestablish contact with our churches in Russia that had been essentially, we had lost contact with for forever and ever. And so in some places, we recovered the title to the deeds that we had of churches in Estonia and Latvia, and restarted Methodism in Russia with their initiative. We couldn't have done it if Russian Methodists hadn't wanted to restart the churches. So my point is, there's this long connection. Now, I'll tell you a story. In 1992, I was not General Secretary, but I was on the staff of the General Board of Church and Society, and one of our board members was a professor from East Germany named Ulrich Meisel. I don't remember exactly when East Germany and West Germany emerged, but it was right around that time, after the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, and then within a year or two, the two countries came back together to be Germany. So Ulrich stood up one day on the plenary floor of the Board of Church and Society. To be honest, it was much like this. We all, at the Board of Church and Society, the board members sit at tables, and there's a few more people than are in this room, but it's a room about this size and not very many more people. And he said, I want to tell you something. He said, you have the image in this country that Ronald Reagan increased defense spending and overwhelmed the Soviet Union, and that led to the collapse of communism. He said, let me tell you the real story. He said, I was always a Christian. He said, that meant that I could never be the chair of the department I think he was a psychologist of the Department of Psychology. It meant that I couldn't go to many conferences. My career path had a ceiling on it because of my choice to remain a Christian. He said, for 17 years I could not travel internationally because I was a Christian. I was not a communist. He said, but I lived in East Germany, and I continued to attend church. And he said, and not many of us attended church. Well, quite frankly, not many attended church in West Germany either. But he said, we knew that things were going to change when people started coming back to church. He said, you see, that was one way that you could show protest against the government. He said, many of these people who came back weren't saying, you know what, I found Jesus. I've devoted my life to Jesus. Some did. He said, but this was one of the few institutions outside of state control that had continued to exist. And he said, so more and more and more people began to come to church. Not just his local church, but all churches. And he said it scared the heck out of the government of East Germany. And he said they would send the police to be in church. We accepted that. What were we doing? We were worshiping God. He said then they began sending the soldiers to be around the church. And he said, to scare us. And he said, but we knew, all of us knew, that in essence, the population had withdrawn its consent from the government. And he said it was the church that was the vehicle for the disintegration of the repressive government. It was a very matter-of-fact, and I thought very powerful story. In a sense, the church helped bring a change, a revolution, really. I think this kind of story can be told in many settings, in many, many different ways, in many different places. Last month, we had our governing board meeting in St. Louis because of Ferguson. And so I went to St. Louis a month ahead of time and went over to Ferguson, and I talked to United Church of Christ pastors and Disciples of Christ pastors and United Methodist pastors and Lutheran pastors and so forth, who are simply pastoring congregations in the midst of Ferguson. And I found that most of these pastors and their congregations were right there on the front lines. Were they throwing rocks? Were they burning cars? No. They were simply opening the doors to their churches. They were bringing in young people who were upset and angry. They were having conversations. They were going over and talking to the police. They were talking to the mayor and so forth. How do we try to knit this together? How do we try to change and improve our societies? That's what churches do in the best when they're at their best, everywhere and all over, whether it's at the national or world level or it's at the local level. So I was fascinated. Many times, apparently, over the years, the National Council of Churches Governing Board, made up of the leaders of these various denominations, meet in airport-type hotels, as you can imagine. You can fly in, you can get to your meeting, and you can get out. And so we met in the basement of an AME church, AME Zion Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And so we're meeting in a local church, and it doesn't always have the best Wi-Fi. It doesn't have, you can't walk down to the front and grab the shuttle to the airport. It's a little less convenient, and I wondered how these church leaders, archbishops and secretary generals and synod leaders and presidents would react. They came up to me just kind of casually and they said, this is where we should be meeting, in our churches. And I said, amen to that. This is what we should, this is who we are. I mean, if you really look at it, there's more than 100,000 local churches all across the country, that, including our 30,000 United Methodist churches, and 40 million Christians who are all connected here through the National Council of Churches. And these are churches, I think, that have an ethos of saying, you're Jewish, you're Muslim, you're Sikh, you're Zoroastrian, great, let's work together. Let's join in, whatever it is. We need to reduce gun violence. We need to reduce poverty. We need to reduce nuclear weapons. Whatever it is, we're there with you. And so, Linda, right? I'm sorry. Yes. Linda and I were talking. Lisa, I'm sorry. Lisa and I were talking before we began. And, well, Lisa, you put the question to me, because I think you said you were going to ask, or wanted to ask the question. If you don't mind, just phrase it as you wish.
How much can the churches influence culture? How much will culture listen to the wisdom and faith of churches these days?
Right, right. That's a great question. And the days are gone when on Monday morning the New York Times would reprint the sermons of the 3 or 4 leading clergy in New York City. Although Christianity's on our airwaves all the time, but it's often not the Christianity of our churches. It tends to be more evangelical. In fact, I used to say to the General Secretary of the United Methodist Communications, would that our church as a denomination had bought 40 and 50 years ago radio stations across this country when they were going for a song and had on there not just United Methodists, but Presbyterians and Lutherans and so forth, maybe psychologists talking about how you raise your kids, you know, or you know, doctors talking about how to live a healthier life, and maybe rebroadcasting some of our sermons and so forth, but basically having our type of Christianity on the airwaves. But we didn't do it, and we sort of gave away the airwaves in a lot of ways to the TV preachers, and I think we rue the day for that. But we have a tremendous influence really all around, and I also said to Lisa, I said, like you, I'm raised in the Midwest, and if you stand up, and I kind of almost feel like this right now, and you talk about how wonderful you are and all the things that your organization does, there's this little bit of feeling like, I'm not really raised that way, to shine the light on me and my group and my church and so forth. We just do what we do because that's what we're supposed to do. And so I think one of the reasons that we often don't get much credit for what we have done on bringing about changes, for positive changes in this nation and around the world is because we don't toot our own horn very much. But if you think about the great movements of this past half century, think about that civil rights struggle. That was a faith-led struggle. Or the movement to try to bring better relations between nations such as the Soviet Union and the United States, or Cuba and the United States, or the women's movement, the environmental justice movement, the movement for the rights and dignity of all people. I could go, the movement to end apartheid, to end the Vietnam War, many, many movements in this country that are portrayed often as secular movements were and are in fact moral and spiritual movements. Now in most cases, if not every case, the church had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the end. But once there, I can tell you, we're pillars. We're pillars of these movements for social change. And I think if we withdrew those movements and said they didn't ever exist, it would be a far different and frankly a grimmer society than it is now. And we have yet, we know, so much more to do I mean, the two reporters were telling me that one of the things you're experiencing here in Rockford is a real spike in crime and violence. And what's a word of hope? When we look for words of hope. I told him, I said, you know, in 1982 to 86, I lived in New York City as a young staff person with the General Board of Urban Ministries and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and later with Board of Church Society. At that time, there were 2,200 murders a year in New York. And I didn't think anything of it because that's just what it was. Now there's 300 murders a year in New York. New York still has plenty of problems. We all know that. We saw the tremendous grief over killing the 2 police officers last week. But I can tell you, when you walk around New York now compared to 30 years ago, it's a different setting. Can you say that was done because of the churches? No, not exactly. But in various places around the world and around the country, can things improve? Of course they can. So I was suggesting in communities like Rockford, we've got to keep our eye on those sorts of things that are needed, such as livable wage, better health care, affordable housing, outreach between communities that are alienated from one another. You know, those are the basics of what we do as people of faith, that we advocate for the least, the last, and the lost among us. I'll say one more word and then I'll conclude. There's times where I was so grateful for the news, as shocking as it was, about Cuba, because I think I had reached a point where I was feeling really quite bleak about how things were. I mean, if you look back over this last year, there's the unaccompanied minors coming across the country in large numbers. The continuing bad news about climate change. the news out of Syria and Iraq, in terms of, especially, in terms of what's happening there, period. But as General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, where we have the Syrian Orthodox Church, and we have the Syrian Church of the East, and other Orthodox churches, tremendous pain at the number of deaths of Christians and the suffering of Christians in that part of the world. We can go on and on and on and talk about a lot of negative things that have taken place. And I also, I hearken back to a book that has had a lot of, I felt was a very influential book for me, written about 10 years ago. It's called The Sorrows of Empire: Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic, by a guy named Chalmers Johnson. And Johnson said 10 years ago, if we continue on the path we're on now, we will see 4 sorrows visit the United States. He said one of those will be perpetual war, leading to more terrorism against Americans. I think we've seen evidence of that. Second, we'll see a loss of democracy and constitutional rights as the presidency fully eclipses the power of Congress. Third, truthfulness will be replaced by a system of propaganda, disinformation, and glorification of war in the military legions. And fourth, we'll see bankruptcy as too much money gets invested in war and in spying apparatuses, and not enough into health and welfare of our people. There's times where I almost wonder if the momentum down that path is irreversible. And then there's other moments where I see the release, at least of portions of the torture report, and I think, you know what, no, we have to know, and we're going to insist that light be shined even on some of the worst things that we've done, so that we learn a lesson, so that we say we won't do this kind of thing again. So I have to admit, I sometimes weave back and forth between hope and despair when we talk about what we can do for peace. But always for me as a Christian, I come back to hope, to the belief that it can be on earth as it is in heaven, to the fact that we follow the Prince of Peace, and one who himself, at this time, 2,000 years ago, was an infant with his parents, was fleeing for his life because the Roman Empire, through their secret police, were attempting to find and eradicate him. He had to go to Egypt. Throughout the life of Jesus, he knew that he was in the midst of world events that were unfolding around him. His entire life, he lived in an occupied nation. He was not a political figure, but he knew what was happening around him. And I think that as Christians, we need to know what's happening around us. We need to be committed to and involved in struggles for peace. So I'm really glad to be back with you. Thank you for having me. Sit here.
Title again, the book title.
Oh, The Sorrows of Empire: Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic, by Chalmers Johnson. You can probably get it for about 19 cents on Amazon. Yes.
Do you have time for questions?
Sure. If I can persuade Stanley to get me some more water, please.
You got it.
Give me some water. I would say that in those 10 years since that was published, The Four Sorrows, or 15 years, that the great sorrow really is the climate injustice upon this whole planet, and it's the one thing that we're all in.
Mm-hmm.
All the countries are in. There's no country that isn't in it. And I've lived through the civil rights movement, the apartheid movement, where there was a real divestment movement. Eventually, it took a hell of a long time. And the church wasn't the first responders to that. And the question is, how can the National Council of Churches address something so huge that it almost needs to be a national level? Because we're the last ones to come to the table on this, our nation, and it is the great sorrow of our time. and it is the great thing that we're sleeping through as a church.
Yes.
Now, we saw the head of the Evangelical Council of Churches several years ago now. Was it Sist, is his name?
Rich Cizik.
Cizik, yeah. He came out because he had talked to climate scientists in England.
Yeah.
And he'd been converted to this justice issue. And he created quite a stir in churches. And I think in some ways upended the views of a lot of evangelical people and clergy. What can the National Council of Churches do along that line? Because the way we go into things is, I've been a pastor for 45 years. The way we go into things is so plodding and slow that we're not even in the race here.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd say a couple things. First of all, Rich's commitment, conversion, shall we say, on the issue of climate change also led to his termination as the head of the National Association of Evangelicals.
Yes.
But he wasn't deterred, and he now is the head of New Evangelicals for the Common Good. And you're right, it did begin to help lead to a change in view among many, not all, many evangelical leaders. And that's really been welcome and been great. The National Council of Churches created a few years ago an eco-justice program, and it's now called Creation Care Ministries. We have, through our various denominations, there's a lot of wonderful work going on there. So I'm going to start at the point that you make about the plotting and about the small aspect of it. So and it sounds small. But if you think about what some of these denominations have been doing now, we've got organizations like Interfaith Power and Light, there's another one on the tip of my tongue, but a variety of, so an infrastructure has been created in a lot of ways. We have a lot of churches that are committed. Actually, if I can first say how grateful I am that Grace United Methodist Church is hosting us, and then urge them to move to the paper or ceramic cups. But I remember about 15 years ago in my own local church, the kitchen committee made the decision to move to, actually not even paper, but just ceramic cups, regular coffee cups. Why, you would have thought that they had called for, we all think of something amazingly radical. They were denounced as tree huggers and the whole 9 yards. And I think that little kitchen committee was like, we actually weren't even environmentalists. We were trying to save money, but we did hear it would be good for the environment. But now, if anyone went back to that local church and said, you know what, we ought to bring back styrofoam cups, people would say, no, we're proud that we made this decision and we've stuck with it and so forth. My point being there, in a tiny way, in countless places across this nation, churches, through decisions such as that, or on how they heat or cool their churches, or how they have constructed new facilities and so forth, have played their small role and have helped to support the ethos of recycling and environmental justice consciousness and so forth and so on. A small but not insignificant aspect of contributing to consciousness raising has taken place through the churches. Now at the international level, the churches have been part for decades and decades of all of these important conferences, Rio and so forth, now upcoming is the Paris conference and what have you. So, and on places like Capitol Hill, the churches have been lobbying for legislation and changes on everything from emissions controls to how much the gas mileage should be. I mean, we can talk about all the things that churches have done, and yet. So a couple months ago, I was invited by the Secretary of Energy. How many of you all can name the Secretary of Energy? Can anybody, by the way? No, I couldn't either.
Imhoff.
No, Ernest J. Moniz, M-O-N-I-Z. He's our Secretary of Energy, which is an incredibly powerful position in the United States government. And so Secretary Moniz invites me and some others to come and meet with him. Okay, so we go into his office and we're sitting there, and he gives us this piece of paper. And it's a letter signed 10 years ago by church leaders and climate scientists about warning of if we don't take action, we're going to see tremendous dangers ahead. So he said, turn it over. And there he was. He had signed it. He was a professor at MIT at the time. And he said, I just want to tell you, he said, this next year is going to be really important. We have Lima conference, which just took place last month. We've got Paris coming up. He said, we have to make progress on bringing about efforts to reduce, forestall, do what we can, because we're really past the time. But to do what we can to limit the impact of climate change. And he said, I called you all together because I know how important the churches are. Now, when I say the churches, let me hasten to add, it was also Sikhs and Muslims and Jews in the room. It wasn't just Christians. He said, I wanted you all here because we've got to work more closely together, and I'm used to working with you all. So he then said, I want to go around there and just tell me what you all are doing. And of course, everyone wanted to tell the Secretary of Energy how my organization is doing the following. When it came to us, I said, I want to tell you how much I appreciate that you've passed this letter around. I said, I remember seeing that letter 10 years ago, and I've long forgotten it. And I said, and I certainly had long forgotten that you were a signature on it. So I want to tell you how much I appreciate that you signed the letter, and how I want to tell you how much I appreciate that you've called us together and want us to work closely. And I said, and I want to tell you how I'm really, frankly, kind of ashamed, because if you think about it, key faith leaders had recognized the danger, along with climate scientists. They'd spoken out all these years ago, and I said, it didn't really translate to any significant changes in everyday life of our people. I mean, and that, I'm not saying it's just completely to blame, but you know, there's times where you feel like you can almost say, what's the use, right? But I know it's part of a long-term struggle. But this is a struggle that I feel like is so overwhelming and urgent that we could come to a point here where we've reduced military spending to a fraction. We've eliminated poverty. We have health care for everyone. I mean, all these great advances, and oops, just as we accomplish that, the Earth can no longer sustain human life. Right. I mean, there's part of me that feels like this is almost, the reality that we can't see because it's so scary and so big in front of us. But it's so urgent that I wish I could tell you that I had the master plan, but the churches are aware, they're involved, we're just not doing enough.
It's just disappointing for me as a Lutheran pastor for 45 years and involved ecumenically, that our churches are talking about stewardship or something like that. Whereas I have to go to 350.org to talk about the divestment of fossil fuels. Why can't the churches talk about that?
That's a great, and I remember being part myself in the 1970s and 80s of efforts to, I was a student at the University of Illinois, and a group of us with the Coalition Against Apartheid, we visited all 9 of the statewide elected trustees of the University of Illinois and urged them to vote to sell stock in companies that supported the apartheid regime in South Africa. And of course, we were part of an international movement. Every one of the trustees told us one-on-one, I'll vote to divest, but I won't make the motion. They never divested. They never divested. And within our own denomination as United Methodists, we never divested from stocks and companies that benefited from the rule of the apartheid regime in South Africa. I could be wrong on that. I know that individual agencies like Church and Society did, but it was a tremendous struggle. And the same thing is happening right now in our various denominations around fossil fuels, because so many of our pension funds and so forth are deeply invested in fossil fuels. And I have talked to money managers for the years who said, well, we have at Board of Church Society, we had all these social screens. We won't invest in companies that have benefit from pornography, from gambling, from alcohol, from nuclear weapons. We could go on and on and on. We did not have a fossil fuel screen, and to be honest, it wasn't on our radar, I'm ashamed to say. And right now, then every money manager will tell you, well, you can avoid these other social sins, but you can't avoid fossil fuels. But now, The Economic Policy Institute for Policy Studies, Economic Policy Institute, a variety of others are doing the analysis and saying, yeah, you don't have to sacrifice the future of your clergy and lay employees and so forth by staying in fossil fuels. It will be, and it is, emerging as the one of the major issues of the next few years for us.
Are you familiar with the Citizens Climate?
The Citizen Climate Campaign?
Lobby.
I'm sorry?
The Citizens Climate Lobby.
Yeah, yeah.
To me, that is, if there's a magic bullet, that's it. To have every single district in the country having people talking to their congressmen, having a fossil fuel fee, not a tax. It's not a tax, but the government doesn't keep it. Have all that money go to the citizens, and have the natural forces that Republicans love work
Right.
to change everything.
Yeah.
Do you want to share something about that?
Well, I'm going to speak on a more broad sense in this regard, and that is, and because of my role at the National Council of Churches, I receive constantly, therefore, the electronic updates from these various denominations, and so now I also receive, therefore, the action alerts of the Presbyterian Church and the ELCA and the Episcopal Church and the United Methodist Church and so forth. And quite frankly, you can very quickly click onto these alerts and send a message to your member of Congress on whatever the issue is. Do I think that that in and of itself brings about change? No, I don't. But I want to tell you, I've been in a lot of members of Congress's offices over the years, and I've seen and heard with my own eyes members of Congress's walk in and say to the staff, what's the count? So in other words, whatever the hot issue of the moment is, what are we hearing from back home? That's 9-1 running this way or that way. They are keenly aware of whatever constituents are saying on a crucial issue at any given moment. If we're not taking the opportunity to be in touch with these elected officials, we just kind of give up the opportunity. And of course, the best time to be in touch with them is right about now, when they're back home in their area. In fact, you should probably have whoever your member of Congress or your senator come in here to this kind of thing, where you can give them, you know, the Stanley Campbell Award, you know, that kind of thing. Because they'll always come to and accept an award.
Make one up.
Make one up.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. And then that's where then you also pin them down. And you know, you don't have to say, oh my gosh, we only have 40 people here. They are happy to be in a room with 40 people. And if it's, we're 40 voters, and this is our passion or whatever it is, I mean, you've got to use those moments and make those moments.
Well, that leads me, one of those things you were, the four things from that book, was one about the president
Power.
taking more power.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of my big frustrations, is Congress is worthless. I mean, nothing happens. They just...
It's a really tough time.
How do you try as a citizen, and maybe we all need to be contacting them all the time, but it's so frustrating.
It is so frustrating. Well, let me tack on just one more thing about meeting with members of Congress. As at the National Council of Churches, there's a variety of places. I'm sure you all are part of any number of social service organizations, or whatever you want to call them, homeowners associations, any number of things you're part of in your life. But not very often, in my experience, do the churches like ours, again, Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists and American Baptists and United Church of Christ and so forth and so on, not very often do we speak to members of Congress and other elected officials as Christians. We tend to speak as voters. We sort of separate our faith life from our civic life. But that's not the way many of our own fellow citizens, Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and evangelicals and Catholics, they very often will speak to elected officials from their faith identity. I think one of the things when we think about how these major Protestant denominations have declining influence, that's not really our ethos, and part of it is this. we have not tended to see ourselves as persecuted minorities. And frankly, we haven't been. But if you are part of a group such as Jews or Muslims, Catholics who are bigger than all of us, but yet are always talking about how persecuted they are, I mean, that becomes a motivating factor. And I'm not suggesting that we try to find some grievance and talk about how, but you know, climate change equally affects all of those groups. We need to also identify and speak to our members of Congress and elected officials as Christians. These are all people of faith themselves to one level or another. Now, you talked about the gridlock in Congress, and it's really painful to experience. I was talking to a staff person in Nancy Pelosi's office, former Speaker of the House, some months ago. She was actually talking to several of us faith leaders, and she said, let me tell you a story. She said, I was going through the security at the Capitol to go to my office, and there was a staff person from a Republican office. We knew each other. We were talking about our kids. And we got through the security, and we collected our purses and all that kind of stuff and headed off to our offices. And later we compared notes, and both of us had been accosted by our colleagues. Why were you talking to? And she said, that's normative now on Capitol Hill. She said, not when I started, but that's normative now. She said, not just staff, members of Congress, they don't know each other, they don't talk to each other. It is the enemy camp. It's a dramatic change in 20 years. You can date it to about 20 years ago to this situation. It's not an easy situation to repair, but one major factor is that these folks have to spend day and night raising money for the next campaign. There was a time where we didn't blink about our members of Congress moving their families to suburban Maryland, suburban Washington, enrolling their kids in school, and then coming back here frequently, but not feeling, you know, now there's that whole thing of like, you're just of Washington. And so families stay here, and now money rules the game so much. We've got to work for things that is hard in this current situation. But I had an email last week from, I forget who it was, but somebody who's working with Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland, who wants to work with the faith community on campaign election finance reform. Would the churches work with him? I responded, I said, absolutely. I'll be back after Christmas. Let's set up a meeting. He's a junior congressman. He's a Democrat. That means he has no power. Because, you know, in Capitol Hill, in the House, the majority party runs everything. In the Senate, the minority party can use all kinds of parliamentary maneuvers to continue to exercise power. Not so in the House. So there was a part of me that was like, John Sarbanes, I remember his dad used to be in the Senate. This guy has no influence. And I thought, who am I to say that we're not going to, you know, thank you for contacting us. Most of these denominations have for years said, let's have a sensible campaign finance system in this country to you know, we need these folks concentrating on their jobs. We don't need big money running everything. And so there's some of this stuff that we've got to push. I mean, if you really, it's not just that these guys have gotten meaner, maybe they have, but a lot of it is, this is the system they're stuck in too.
Well, I think this is general. It's so much me. We don't think of the others. And this is just in everyday everything. I mean, it's not just the government.
It's not just the government.
Everything.
There was a poll that I read about this morning online. I get the Washington Post and at home, so I get the digital version. And the Washington Post and ABC News did a poll looking at asking blacks and whites about their perception of how fair society is. Well, as you can imagine, 20%, I think it was, maybe even less, of African Americans said, yeah, it's fair. Almost everyone was like, no, of course it's not fair for African Americans. And then among whites, of course, most of us said, yeah, it's fair for everybody. But then they had an analysis, and they said the broadest, the greatest divide now exists between how white Democrats and white Republicans view it. With one group saying, yeah, it's fair for everyone, and the other group saying, increasingly, no, it's not fair. So even in most of us, not all of us in this room are white, So we know it too in our community that there's a growing split. And that requires, I don't know, that's not going to be changed by campaign finance reform. That's going to be, that's something we have to address in our community. And we need to do it because we're the majority community, you know. The minority community can't do this. And so when I was there in St. Louis with the National Council of Churches, I was curious as to how local pastors and local Christians would see us coming into town. And to my great surprise, they said, thank you for coming in here. We need the spotlight of the National Council of Churches and all these denominations together here to shine on what's happening. And one of the pastors, the pastor who hosted us, contacted me a week later, and he said, I'm on a bus from Ferguson to Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri, and he said, one of our bus windows has been shot out. And then I turned on the TV, and lo and behold, right there, it talked about how they were going through the town of Rosebud, Missouri, a tiny little town, and they were walking. They did some on the bus, but most of it was walking. And townspeople had come out and put on the main street buckets of fried chicken and stuff like this, and had drawn up signs against these protesters marching to Jefferson City. And they were protesting what had happened in Ferguson. And you realize, my gosh, you know, this is not covert. This is, and we all know it, it's oftentimes very overt racism that continues to take place in our society. We've got to deal with that in our community. You know? So that it's not just members of Congress not talking to each other. It's very, very deep, very powerful. There's times where I'm thinking, my gosh, what can we possibly do? And the National Council of Churches once had 500 staff. I've got 8. You know, there's part of me that thinks, what can I accomplish? But, you know, we keep going, you know, and you know, many of our churches are smaller. The National Council of Churches is smaller because so too is the Lutheran Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, and so forth and so on. But these church leaders, when they restructured the National Council of Churches a couple of years ago, they said, if we got rid of the National Council of Churches, we'd have to recreate it. Because we need a voice, we want to be together, we believe in being together. This is an essential part of our faith. It's not going to be easy, but we want to bring about a better society.
Well, I was just thinking this morning about Simeon living into the promise of Messiah.
Yes.
And so part of what I did today was postulate the kinds of promises I'd love our children to live into.
Yep.
You know, that before they die, they will see the end of our dependence on fossil fuel. I believe that. I believe that could happen.
I think it's very possible.
That before they die, that this gap, this gulf between people of color will be gone.
Oh.
I pray for that. I mean, we've made a lot of progress, and we got so much farther to go. Now, it was interesting what you were. I was sitting there listening to the passage on Simeon today in the lectionary, reading it, and where Simeon takes the baby Jesus from his parents as they bring him to the temple, and he says, now I can die. You know, I've been waiting for this baby to come. And you know what I thought to myself, and I hope this doesn't sound too sacrilegious, I thought, I hope Simeon had been saying that to the parents of every baby for years. not just to cover his bets, but to say, I want every parent to hear, you know, there's hope here in every child. You know, all of these children can be part of an effort, you know, movement. I mean, there they were living literally under Roman military occupation, you know, where the Romans were stealing the livestock and raping the women and pressing the men into service. I mean, these are tough, hard times. Here comes this baby, you know, every baby, perhaps. And maybe that was the only one, but I had this feeling, but he said that to every baby, and I hope he did. Thank you so much.
I'm going to ask our district superintendent to close us with a prayer, if that's okay. And I remind you, please pick up one of the books and a pen and help remove some of the food too. But I also want to ask if you can make a donation for Rockford Urban Ministries. We're looking on another tough year, but one in which we're doing okay, but we are losing a little bit of the conference's support because of cutbacks there. And so any donation will be appreciated. Lisa, would you like to come in?
Let's stand and we'll just gather as people. Let us pray. O Holy One who comes to us as the Prince of Peace, help us each day to be followers of the way of peace. Help us to find ways to turn spears into pruning hooks, to turn swords into plowshares. Help us every day to learn to turn the other cheek and to reach out in love and forgiveness. Help us every day to find another way, a new way, to reach out in love and concern to our neighbor who might be different than ourselves, but nevertheless are your children. We pray for your spirits. We pray for the work. We pray that there will be this day when your kingdom will come fully on earth as it is in heaven. It is in Christ's name that we go and live. Amen.